Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm E.G. Stone and this is a Wednesday Reads book review. This week I read a piece of Christian fiction called The Road to Revelation, The Beginning, by Clifford T Wellman Jr. And now this book is sort of the first in a series of books that speculate on what would happen if the end times, biblical end times, were to come about in modern times. Now, this was done right at the turn of the election, or turn of the presidency in the American politics, speculating on what would happen there, and it talked about things like Iran taking over the Middle East, or what would happen if most of the superpowers of the world, excluding the United States, were to get together, and what would happen. And it's very much talking about biblical end times as according to the book of Revelations primarily. Now, there were multiple characters and multiple scenes that were going on, talking about this character was doing this and this character was thinking that about the end times and preparing, and what it meant, and who was involved and who were the terrorists and who was bringing things about and why, and that sort of a thing. So end time books are fairly common and fairly popular, and it is widely believed that we are actually in the biblical end times. However, there is a huge amount of interpretation that goes into talking about the end times, because for those of you who don't know biblical prophecy, there are several books, Daniel, Ezekiel, Revelations, even some of the other minor prophets, as well as some of the New Testament, Matthew, these things, they talk about the end times, but most of these references to the end times are very non-specific. Most of the book of Daniel talks about interpretation of dreams that King Nebuchadnezzar has had and how it relates to the end times, and it's very much hard to interpret. It's difficult to understand, and a lot of speculation has been put into figuring out when the end times are going to be. However, there's also fairly plainly stated the fact that no man shall know when the end times are going to come about, when the second coming of Christ is going to happen, and yet you'll see the signs. So this is kind of complicated, this whole situation, and it can be difficult to talk about because it very much polarizes the world between those who believe and those who do not. However, it is also a chance for those who do not believe to sort of change their beliefs and figure out what they believe and whether or not they believe in God and that Jesus is the Savior. And so it can be good and it can be bad depending on how you look at it, because it is absolutely the end of the world as we know it, and it is also a chance for redemption and sort of the beginning of something that is meant to be really great. However, it's a very difficult time, and there's wars amongst nations, there's earthquakes, there's natural disasters, famines, the Antichrist. It's all very, very complicated, and no one knows exactly what the heck is going to happen and who is going to be involved, because names are not specifically mentioned, at least no names that make sense when translated or interpreted. So this book talks a lot about the actual sort of ideas about why now being a couple of years ago, is the end times. And honestly, I think this book read more like a documentary voiceover than it did a piece of fiction. It felt more like, okay, here is all of this evidence that people have gathered, and here's why this makes the most sense. However, it was more, I don't know, it was a bit hand-wavy in terms of the evidence. There was no, it made sense, but it didn't provide a counter argument, and it didn't say where the evidence was coming from. So that was a little bit frustrating for me, knowing that it is hugely open to interpretation. And as far as the characters went, I sort of have no idea why they were there. a lot of, two of the characters, Ford and Sam, were definitely main characters and are probably going to end up in the next book or two, whatever, sort of leading the charge to join Christ and Christ's army and all of that. So that sort of makes sense. But they also felt a little bit like, hey, we're just here to spout off the evidence, and didn't really feel like they were part of the story, and they were more just saying, oh, yes, Ford spent hours doing research, and here's the research, and that was sort of it. I didn't feel a connection there. And then for the other characters, there were some that showed up that was like, why are you here? Why am I talking about you? What point do you actually have to the story besides being a witness that we don't really need to know all that much about? So that was a bit difficult. And as far as a piece of Christian fiction goes, I think this could have actually done better. A lot of the point of writing about the end times is to sort of say, hey, for all you people who don't know God, then maybe you should think about this. And that can be done in a multitude of ways. A lot of things are very much sort of believe or die. A lot of things are very much maybe sort of a bit more hand-wavy. The modern reality of Christianity, especially in Western countries, is that things are not quite as concrete or as challenging as perhaps they should be when faced with the truth of Christian beliefs and biblical reality. So this book felt a little bit like that, where I feel like there could have been a lot more emotion involved, a lot more, here's why we want you to consider this option of Christianity, here's why we believe that this is the best route and why it matters. Instead, this sort of just assumed that you already knew what was going on and why, and it didn't feel like, okay, so the end of the world, all right, this is all terrible, and I didn't feel like there was that terror there. I didn't feel like there was joy at the coming of Christ either. I just felt like everything was sort of flat, and it was, okay, here's the evidence for the end times, and therefore it's the coming of Christ. All right, great. But what does that mean for people? It was, why is this important? What is it that makes this so important to the world? And so it felt a little bit flat, and I feel like a lot of the point of being a Christian was sort of missed, because it talked a little bit about why Jesus was important and the whole sacrifice, but it didn't talk about what that actually meant. It more talked about, okay, here's what happened sort of between the Jewish faith and then switched to Christianity, and that's fine, but you have to talk about why that's significant. There was a lot of the why that wasn't there. So this book, as a story, I think exploring the end times is a very commendable thing to do, and it's also very difficult because of the amount of uncertainty that is there. But I think this story didn't deal with it as well as it could have. There was a lot of the why that was missing. I feel like the characters were flat and I didn't know why they were there. And as far as the religious aspect, I felt more like I was listening to a documentary talking about research on the end times as opposed to actually reading a book of fiction saying, okay, here's something meaningful and here's why we want this to happen, and if the end times comes, here's what you can do and it's going to be okay. It felt a little flat. And there were a few mistakes that could have been picked up by an editor that I saw, so this definitely needed perhaps another edit. I appreciate the attempt at talking about the end times. I appreciate the research that went into this. It was very extensive and it talked about a lot of connections, and it went through and explained a whole lot about the end times that is very much uncertain and left up to interpretation for most people. So that was nice, but I think as a work of fiction it left something to be lacking. So if you are interested in learning more about this or reading more about the biblical prophecy of the end times, there are links in the description box below. I will leave all of the links to Clifford T Wellman Jr.'s works, and you can talk with him about any of the questions that you might have. I am not an expert on Revelations or the end times, so if you have questions, refer them to him, not me. I can sort of guide you, but I'm not an expert. It's been a while since I have researched that at all. So if you have any questions, let me know, let him know, and I hope that is helpful. That was with this week's Wednesday Reads, and I hope you stay out of the heat and have a good day. I will see you next time. Bye.